All right, so we are at 12, so we'll get going. For those who are on the call as of this moment, thank you and welcome. I'll do a quick round of introductions as to who's who on this call. So I'm Jacqueline Pelchetic. I'm the project manager for the election. I'll be doing most of the talking today. We also have David LaFleur. He is the returning officer for the election. We have Cheryl Wong. She is the alternate returning officer. And then we also have Tamara Dallimore, who is one of our ledge officers. She's also going to be helping us with the election and with this call. So I will just take a few moments to do some housekeeping items. Just a little disclaimer, I do not intend to talk for the full hour. I have about 20 minutes worth of material, but I do want to leave lots of room for questions for those who are attending this session. So this session is being both live streamed and recorded. It will be available on our elections webpage for those who wish to go back and rewatch the session at a later date, or for those who were unable to join us at this time. Now you'll notice that as per the webinar function, you're all muted and your video is disabled. This is just to keep the session a bit more orderly and to save on bandwidth. Throughout the session, if you do have any questions, please type them into the chat bar. Actually, I think for the webinar function, there is the Q&A bar on your toolbar. So just type your question into there, and we will be answering those questions at the end during the Q&A portion of the session. So with that, today we'll be covering the topics you see on screen here. Our goal today is to provide everybody with a solid overview of the legislative requirements surrounding third-party advertisers. Now, my second disclaimer of the day, none of this is legal advice. If you do need further interpretation, please seek independent legal advice. All information provided in the presentation is really just a summary of the third-party advertising provisions of the Local Authorities Election Act. This is brand new legislation for municipalities for the 2021 election year, and we did not have third-party advertising requirements for the 2017 municipal election. So with that, on the agenda today, we'll talk about third-party advertising, what third-party advertising is, who is considered an advertiser, what is and what is not considered advertising under the Act. Then we'll move on to advertiser eligibility and ineligibility and who can be an advertiser. Next, we'll chat about the relation between the advertiser and the candidate. Then we'll move into advertising requirements and the registration of the advertiser. Finally, we'll end off with advertiser finances. And as you'll see, these do mirror the finance requirements of candidates. So what is third-party advertising? This is any election advertising done by a corporation, a group, or a person who is not the candidate or who is not a candidate. Keep in mind the wording advertising message. This is pretty broad. It means that the advertising is not confined to just election signs, which are commonly used by candidates, what many people see during election periods. The Local Authorities Election Act also includes an advertising period. This is May 1st of the election year until election day. This year it is on Monday, October 18th. This is the period in which any advertiser may register and conduct advertising activities. More on that soon, on the registration soon. And with that, we'll just move on. As I said, advertising can be pretty broad. So the advertising can include paid social media posts or ads. It can include traditional print media ads, radio, television ads, and then of course those election and billboard signs. It also includes events or canvassing, which are held to support any candidate or to oppose any candidate. Now, some things that are not advertising include editorials, debates, interviews, opinion pieces, blog and unpaid social media posts, any communication to employees by a corporation or a group, any unintended transmissions of ads to other jurisdictions. So for example, if an Edmonton third-party advertiser has a radio ad that is broadcast and is heard on the radio in the city of St. Albert, we at the city of St. Albert do not count that as an advertising message. Additionally, something that I don't believe is on the slide here, any advertising that encourages residents to vote is not considered an advertising message under the Act. All right, so now that we have covered the basics of what third-party election advertising is and who may advertise, we're just going to cover what parties are ineligible to register as advertisers. The ineligibility criteria does mirror the ineligibility criteria for candidates up to a certain point. So for those who watched our first information session, you will notice some familiarities. So first, a third party is ineligible to register with the city as an advertiser if the party is an organization that does not carry out business in the province of Alberta. And for clarity, this does include corporations. This also goes for trade unions and employee organizations that are not operating within Alberta. Additionally, individuals cannot register as advertisers if they themselves are not Alberta residents, or also if they are candidates. Candidates cannot be third-party advertisers. Second, registered charities are also ineligible to register as advertisers. Third, prohibited organizations. Now, a prohibited organization, the list is quite long, but this includes any provincial corporations, any municipalities, any Métis settlements, school boards, public post-secondary institutions, or any other publicly funded corporation. So this is a lot of information. So to review, this means that corporations, groups, trade unions, and employee organizations that operate within Alberta and Alberta residents are the only parties eligible to register as third-party advertisers under the Local Authorities Election Act. So it is important to note that the Act strictly prohibits coordination or collusion between the advertiser and the candidate for the purpose of circumventing the contribution limits. For those who watched the first session, you will recall that contribution limits for candidates is a maximum of $5,000 in monetary or gift in kind from each contributor. So the Act would prevent a candidate from maxing out their contribution limit from one contributor and then having the advertiser collect over and above this amount under their own limits in order to advertise with the candidates and circumvent that $5,000 limit. So if you are unsure if your advertising and fundraising activities would be in contravention of the Act, it is imperative that you do seek independent legal advice just to navigate this. So the Act does include identification requirements as well for the individual advertisements. A summary of this: advertisers must identify that first the ad has been authorized by themselves. They must identify themselves within the ad, so their name, and then they also must provide their contact information within the ad. The requirements for how these are presented does vary a little bit between some mediums. So first off here, for print or digital media, the identification would be included on the message itself. An example of this would be a standard static ad, such as an election sign or a newspaper ad. In these examples, the static ad itself, essentially a picture, would contain the advertiser's name, that the ad was authorized, and then also their contact information. A little bit different for telephone advertising. So whether in the form of a pre-recorded or a live message, the telephone number of the advertiser must be capable of appearing on the call display. And this function must not be disabled. So additionally, in the message itself, the name of the advertiser must be stated at the beginning of the message. And again, the message must state that it has been authorized by the advertiser. And then finally, at the end of the message, the advertiser's phone number must be given. Final one on the screen here for broadcasts and electronic media, such as YouTube. At the start of the ad, the third party must identify themselves, state the message has been authorized, and then provide their contact information. So just moving on to registration for the advertisers. So just like with candidates, advertisers must also file with the local jurisdiction pursuant to the Act. However, prior to registration, there are some actions that must be undertaken by the advertiser. So they must ensure that a chief financial officer has been appointed and that an advertising account has been opened at a financial institution. This is information that is required on the registration form. The form is up on our elections webpage now, and you can navigate to that just by clicking under the third-party advertiser tab. It's just right up there on the page. So for filing registration at the moment, as the city is close to appointments with members of the public, registration can be filed by either mailing it to the city, having it couriered over, or dropping it off in the secure drop box just at the front of City Hall. Finally, if there's any changes to any details on the registration form, such as a change to the CFO or financial institution, please do notify us in writing within 30 days of the change, just to update your registration. All right, so when does a third party need to register with the local jurisdiction? So the advertiser must register when it has or when it plans to incur expenses of at least $1,000 related to election advertising, or when it has or plans to accept contributions of $1,000 or more during the advertising period. So again, the advertising period being May 1st to election day. Just to keep in mind, in the course of elections, residents and organizations may participate in small-scale election advertisements as they do without having to register with the city. This legislation instead seeks to regulate the much larger scale advertising activities. So moving on to finances, this section will cover both the legislative requirements around accepting contributions, as well as the financial disclosure reports at the end of the advertising period. Much of these requirements do parallel the financial requirements of candidates. So again, if you watched our first session, a lot of this is going to be pretty familiar to you. So first we'll start off with the basics with contribution. So what is contribution? A campaign contribution is any contribution made to an advertiser that is either money or gift in kind. It is important to note that this does not cover or not include volunteer services. So for example, if you have volunteers who are supporting you in hosting events or carrying out canvassing activities in support or against any candidate, that volunteer work doesn't count as contribution. Now, I do just want to take a moment to briefly cover two items since they're new to the Act. The first is fundraising functions. So a fundraising function is any social function held for the purpose of raising funds for the advertiser. There are specific requirements on how funds raised in this way are calculated as contributions. So therefore, please review the Act carefully if you think this is an option that you would like to pursue. The second item that I do want to go over is loans. So an advertiser may borrow funds from a financial institution for the purpose of financing their advertising campaign. It is important to keep in mind that the repayment of the loan is subject to the contribution requirements of the Act. So this means that payments made on the loan by the advertiser or by any eligible contributor are considered campaign contributions under the Act. So on to contributor eligibility. Who is an eligible contributor? Any of the same parties who are eligible to register as a third-party advertiser are also eligible to contribute to those advertisers. So to recap, this is any Alberta resident, Alberta corporation or group, and of course, Alberta resident who's not the candidate. And then finally, any organization that's not a prohibited organization. So with this new legislation, there are some small nuances to contributions from groups and organizations around whether that contribution gets attributed to the group or to its members. So for contributions that are attributed to the individual members, the amounts paid by the individual members must be paid voluntarily with the understanding that those members are making advertising contributions. The members' names and amounts contributed are then recorded by the advertiser. Now, for contributions not attributed to the members, an example would be where the organization provides a contribution from their own general funds. The contribution is then attributed to the organization itself. So contribution limits. Contribution limits of advertisers is much higher than the limits for candidates. And like candidates, there are currently no limits to how much they may spend. Advertisers may accept a maximum of $30,000 per contributor, and this includes contributions from themselves. So they may self-fund up to $30,000. It is important to note that a contributor can donate $30,000 to as many advertisers as they like. And on the other hand, advertisers may accept as many $30,000 contributions from as many contributors as they like. There's no cap on this. Just as long as they are under that $30,000 per contributor. Like candidates, advertisers may choose to raise funds, self-fund, or do a combination of the two. Now, once the advertiser registers with the city, they may continue to accept contributions if they have already been doing so, over and above the $1,000 pre-registration limit. And they may also incur expenses of more than $1,000 if they have already been doing so. It is important to clarify that the way the legislation is worded, an advertiser may accept contributions prior to registration. So I just want to reiterate this, just as long as they don't exceed that $1,000 in monetary or gift in kind. Receipt. So an advertiser must also issue to each contributor a receipt in the form acceptable to the city. So we have not developed a specific form that advertisers must use. Instead, we have specific criteria. So whatever form the advertiser uses, they just must include the necessary fields, which we have outlined on our third-party advertisers webpage. Okay, so here's another small financial nuance of the new legislation. So when advertisers hold meetings for the conduct of their own business, for example, if a group is holding an AGM meeting, members may make contributions to the group for the purpose of election advertising. Now, where a person contributes less than $50, the aggregate amount of all these less than $50 amounts donated, essentially just the aggregate is recorded, but the donors can remain anonymous. The lump sum is recorded as a contribution in the final financial reporting. Now, where any amounts over $50 are contributed, the individual contributions are recorded as separate contributions. Now, anonymous contribution. So any anonymous contribution over $50 from any source cannot be used. And the advertiser, if they want to use the contribution, they must endeavor to establish the identity of that contributor. If the identity cannot be established, then the contribution is paid to the local jurisdiction. Now, it is also prohibited for advertisers to accept contributions from donors to whom the contribution does not belong. So for example, if a contributor is, contributing money from their cousin or from someone else, this is just to be able to establish whether the contributor was actually eligible to contribute those funds. All right, so a brief note on advertising expenses. Pursuant to the Act, all advertising related expenditures and all contributions coming in must be approved and received by the CFO. At the end of the election period, the advertiser must submit financial reports to the local jurisdiction detailing expenses and also contributions. So it is important that the advertiser retains good records on all their financial activities, and we'll cover that next. So moving on to what happens after the election is over and the advertising period has ended. Just like candidates, advertisers must submit financial documentation to the local jurisdiction by March 1st, 2022 in the required form. The first part of this documentation is the disclosure report, which we'll cover here on this slide. So the disclosure report is a document that details one, the total amount of donations received, which were under $250. So these are going to be recorded as just a lump sum. And then the second, the total amount of donations received, which were over $250. Now, for all of these donations received over $250, the names, addresses, amounts contributed, and dates of contributions, or date of contribution for each of these contributors is also included in this report. Just a little caveat to that. So this form is still under development with the government of Alberta. Once it has been finalized, we will be posting that to our election webpage. So we're just waiting on that form. Okay, now the next document that is required is the advertising return. The return details the expenses, the advertisements to which those expenses relate to. So essentially a listing of all the advertisements, the contributions received, and any supporting documentation for the advertising activities of that third party. This document is prepared by the advertiser's CFO and is also due on March 1st, 2022, the same date as the disclosure report. So you will most likely notice that some of the requirements on the return look like they contain some redundancies between this and the disclosure report. For example, the listing of the contributions. So because we are just waiting on the release of the form templates from the province, for this report as well. Once we have those forms, it will further explain kind of the differences or the different fields required. And again, once we have those, we'll be posting them to our City of St. Albert elections webpage, just under that third-party advertiser tab. In the meantime, advertisers should maintain accurate records of all contributions received, including receipts issued to contributors. And then also advertisers must retain original receipts of expenses, as these could be requested by the city when the advertiser files their final reports. All right, so let's just do a quick recap and compare the disclosure report and the advertising return side by side, as it is foreseeable that there could be some confusion between these two. So the purpose of the disclosure report, being the first report we covered, is to itemize and disclose contributions both under $250 and then also to disclose the names of those contributing over $250 and the total for the over $250 as well. Now, the advertising return, on the other hand, is to show detailed financial activities of the advertiser related to their advertising activities, including the advertisements that they paid for and their related expenses. So I hope that this quick review kind of helps separate the two in everybody's minds. Okay, so we are just finishing up. I just want to take a moment to review the responsibilities of the advertiser that we have covered today. So the first is timely registration. Advertisers must register with the local jurisdiction once they have received or spent $1,000 on advertising activities, or once they intend to accept or spend $1,000 on advertising activities. The second is identification of the advertiser. Advertisers must ensure that their advertisements comply with the identification requirements of the Local Authorities Election Act, and that they clearly identify the advertiser, they identify the ad has been authorized, and also how to contact the advertiser. Third, advertiser must ensure that they comply with the contribution requirements in that they are accepting contributions only from those eligible to provide those contributions, that they're providing receipts where they are required to, and that everything is recorded. Finally, advertisers must also ensure at the end of the advertising period that they are filing the correct financial documents, being the disclosure form and then also the return. All right, so with that, I want to thank everybody who's patiently sat through listening to me talk for the last 26 minutes. It is time for the Q&A period, so I'm just going to quickly go over the process for submitting a question. You should have a toolbar and there should be a function on there that says Q&A. If you have a question, just type it in there and we'll see that question. So we'll give everybody just a few minutes to finish typing if you are doing that. We did have some questions sent in ahead of time, so I will just get started with one of those. One of the questions we received is, as an advertiser, if my volunteers are canvassing door to door, how can I satisfy the identification requirements? So in this situation, the volunteers are going to need to identify themselves, that they're volunteering on behalf of the advertiser. They'll have to let whoever they're speaking to, if they're going door to door, let the homeowner know that their message is authorized, and then also provide the contact information of the advertiser. Okay. So there's no questions coming in through the Q&A yet, so I'm just going to do one more of the questions that came in. So this one is about valuing a contribution. So the question is, how do I value a contribution if it isn't money? This is a good question. So any contributions that are gift in kind are valued at market value. Now, in cases where, say, a company makes a contribution of a product they usually sell, you would take the difference between the market value of the product, so what that product would sell for, minus the cost of the company, and that difference would be the contribution that is recorded. Now, I don't know if there's any other questions coming through. All right, so since there's no questions, I'm going to assume that I did a fantastic job in thoroughly explaining third-party advertising, or everybody is asleep. So thank you everybody for coming and taking part of your lunch hour to listen to me. If you do have any outstanding questions about the election or from this session, please do email us at election@stalbert.ca. And we can follow up with you and find the answers you are looking for. So just to tie this session up, dates for subsequent sessions have not yet been set. Once they have been set, they will be advertised in the same way that this session was advertised. And they will most likely be conducted virtually via Zoom as well. The recording for this session will also be available on the elections webpage as a resource just as soon as we finish posting that up. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody and wish you all a great afternoon.